He stepped into the marble lobby just past 7, shoulders squared, eyes steady, a model case in one hand and blueprints in the other. But the moment the revolving doors closed behind him, it wasn't his presence that drew attention. It was his skin. His boots were worn but clean, his coat thick with the chill of the outside morning air, and yet none of that mattered. What mattered to them was that a black man had entered a space built for decisions, not for questions. From the very first glance, suspicion followed him like a shadow no light could shake. Security didn't ask his name, they asked what he was doing there. Staff didn't wonder about his purpose, they wondered who let him in. What begins as a routine visit spirals into a slow, agonizing trial by assumption, an unspoken verdict pronounced before a single word is exchanged. But what no one in that gleaming, polished tower knows is that they've just turned away the very man who gave the building its bones. This story is built on silence, power, and the truth buried beneath layers of arrogance. Like and subscribe if you're ready to see justice take shape. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what do you think is really happening behind those glass walls? The wind whipped sharp down the corridor of high-rises as Ellison Ridge stepped onto the curb outside Echelon Tower. He shifted the weight of the aluminum model in his right hand and adjusted the blueprint roll slung tight over his shoulder. His boots thudded softly against the concrete as he approached the entrance, their thick soles still holding traces of dried dust from a site inspection earlier that morning. His coat, dark brown canvas, worn at the sleeves and damp at the cuffs, fluttered slightly as the revolving doors spun for the pair ahead of him. A man in a gray blazer and a woman in a crisp white blouse. He didn't look up at the glass facade stretching above him, didn't need to. He already knew every load-bearing joint, every cantilevered edge, every reinforcement grid embedded beneath the foundation. He didn't need a guided tour. He had designed its bones. But Ellison also knew that this building, like so many others, saw only what it wanted. It saw polish. It saw wealth. It saw comfort. It never saw calloused hands and bent metal cases as credentials. He moved forward, reaching for the door, when Clem Dorsey stepped into his path like a human checkpoint. The man had the build of a bouncer and the uniform of someone who believed himself too important for what he was paid to do. His arms folded tightly over his chest, and his eyes landed on Ellison's boots first, then crawled their way up like someone surveying damage. He didn't smile. He didn't ask. He simply told Ellison that there was a temporary lockdown. VIP guests. Lobby access restricted. Orders were orders. Ellison, standing on the threshold with the wind needling into his jacket, glanced past Clem. People were still walking through the lobby. Not one was being stopped. A delivery boy carrying sandwich bags slid through the security gate without so much as a nod. A tall man in a blue suit waved at reception and disappeared into an elevator. Ellison pointed this out. Clem didn't flinch. Exceptions apply, he said. Security protocols. You wait outside. Ellison, lips pressed shut, turned and walked 20 feet back toward the ashtray lane, where 2 trash bins leaned into the wall and cigarette butts littered the ground like dry mulch. He stood still, the cold pushed against his back like a persistent hand. His shoulders rose slightly, bracing the cold, but his arms stayed at his sides. He balanced the case against his thigh. The metal box bore the scars of time, scratches, a chipped corner, a deep dent from when it had fallen off a drafting table one late night, but it still held. The model inside wasn't ornamental. It was functional. Every inch, every tiny beam and column represented stress loads and elevation tensions the average eye would never notice. While Ellison waited, Clem went back to the security desk, leaned one elbow against it, and started a slow conversation with a receptionist who laughed at whatever was being said. No radio call, no clipboard, no action, just waiting. Ellison didn't move. After a few minutes, a janitor rolled out of the side vestibule, dragging a mop and a yellow water bucket. He was thin, wiry, and disinterested. He didn't look at Ellison. He simply moved the mop back and forth across the concrete slab, working his way around Ellison's boots like he was just another post or garbage can. When the mop flicked a small splash of water against his heel, Ellison didn't react. He stared through the glass at the reception desk where Clem was now laughing. The janitor made another slow pass, letting the mop slap slightly against the side of Ellison's boot. No apology, no acknowledgement, just another gesture of dismissal. A full 15 minutes passed before Clem emerged again. His stride was lazy, as though this entire performance was beneath him. He told Ellison that operations hadn't confirmed any guest by that name. Said the name Ridge didn't pull up a record. Ellison explained that he had an appointment scheduled with Harold Boone, design director, floor 39. Clem didn't ask to see ID. He said paper appointments didn't count. They were too easy to forge. Ellison offered to show the contents of his case. Clem shook his head. Could be stolen. Could be from a rejected firm. He then nodded to another security guard inside and called him over. The second man, older and less invested, brought over a wand scanner and started circling Ellison's body without permission. First his arms, then his waist, then the blueprint roll. No beep. Still, Clem pointed at the model case and asked what it was. Ellison replied, "Structural model." Clem made a comment about toys and asked why it wasn't submitted digitally like everyone else. Ellison said nothing. He reached down, popped open one latch, and tilted the case just enough to reveal the miniature lattice framework inside, the steel joints etched with real numerical markings, the base plate signed with initials, his own. Clem didn't look. He turned and asked the second guard to log an unauthorized entry attempt. Then he told Ellison to step away from the door or face a trespass citation. Ellison stood firm. Clem walked up close, just inches away, and said he could have building enforcement remove him permanently, that they didn't need a reason, that he wasn't wearing credentials, that he looked like someone who didn't belong. After 30 minutes of silent dismissal, Clem Dorsey finally returned, this time holding a digital pad. With forced authority and a lazy squint, Clem gestured sharply toward Ellison and ordered him inside. No apology, no admission, just a single phrase delivered with a subtle bite of forced politeness. Secondary screening protocol. Ellison stood, carefully securing his blueprint roll back under his arm, adjusting the weight of the model case. As he entered the lobby, the warm air hit him like a false comfort, but the eyes did not warm. The receptionist barely looked up. The second security guard from earlier motioned him over toward a corner of the lobby, where a low metal table sat beneath a hollow camera mount and a wall of black and white monitors. Clem nodded to the table and ordered Ellison to place all items for inspection. Ellison, jaw tight, laid the aluminum case down with deliberate care. The blueprint roll followed. Clem pointed at the satchel hanging under Ellison's coat. He hadn't brought it forward earlier, a compact fabric pouch with frayed corners and hand-sewn patches along one strap. It was a satchel he had carried for 10 years, one passed down from his brother who had died in an accident on a scaffold years ago. It held the pens he'd used for every draft, a metal ruler etched with microscopic notes, 2-line notepads, and a small analog scale. Clem didn't ask what it contained. He simply told Ellison to unzip it and dump the contents onto the metal table. The command echoed louder than intended, drawing a glance from a nearby administrative assistant waiting for the elevator. Ellison looked at the floor, then back at the table. He unzipped the satchel. His fingers were stiff, not from cold now, but from tension coiling through every joint. He turned the bag over and let the contents fall out, gently at first, then fully as Clem insisted again, louder. A mechanical pencil clattered to the ground and rolled a few feet. No one picked it up. Blueprints folded into quarters spilled open, revealing faded sketches in red and black ink. A tape measure dropped with a thunk. His notepad fell open to a page marked with calculations, the corners dog-eared and worn from repetition. A business card from a former mentor drifted like a leaf toward the floor. A photograph, a small square image of a woman with braids and a child gripping her knee, landed face up by the leg of the table. Ellison stepped instinctively to retrieve it, but Clem stepped in first, planting one boot next to the photo and pretending not to notice. The guard beside him chuckled under his breath. Clem reached for one of the blueprints, tugged it from the pile, and held it up, examining the sheet as if searching for mistakes. He made a theatrical display of flipping it over, nodding at the marks, as though they were written in a foreign language. He asked Ellison where he bought the draft, if it came with a coffee or a certificate. The other guard laughed again. Then Clem made a sharp crease across the paper and began folding, first in half, then again. By the time Ellison realized what was happening, Clem had bent the drawing into a crude triangle, creasing the edges and twisting the tip into a point. He blew a puff of air across the top, as if testing flight balance, and threw the paper plane across the lobby. It sailed unevenly, curved left, and landed face down near a rust-colored puddle beside the service elevator. No one moved. The receptionist didn't flinch. The administrative assistant waiting at the elevators looked away. Ellison's stomach dropped. He stared at the damp floor where the plane now lay, ink bleeding into the tile. Clem clapped his hands twice, mocking applause. He asked Ellison if that's how he presented plans to clients, maybe add a jingle or sell them door to door. Ellison didn't speak. He crouched and slowly began to gather his scattered belongings, returning them one by one to the satchel. The photograph was damp at the corner. The mechanical pencil now had a crack down its spine. He retrieved the ruler last, a gift from his first year working drafts at a community college in Cleveland, now tarnished and scuffed from the fall. Clem stood nearby, arms crossed, as if he had performed a necessary task. Once Ellison had everything but the ruined paper plane, he stood, eyes still forward. He didn't dare ask for the blueprint. It wasn't about that single sheet anymore. It was about not giving them the satisfaction. The silence between them stretched, but Clem finally broke it, telling Ellison he had 10 minutes to make his business quick or be removed. He handed back the satchel without meeting Ellison's eyes. The case remained on the table. Clem inspected the model's hinges, popping them open one at a time without permission. The lid creaked as it lifted, revealing the layered sections inside. The miniature beams, cores, slope columns, and cross joints all arranged in a tight vertical replica of the tower above them. Clem whistled and called it cute. He nudged one of the plastic columns, bending it slightly, then letting it snap back into place. He asked Ellison if he built dollhouses on the side. Ellison said nothing. He waited. After a moment, Clem closed the lid, but didn't latch it. When the elevator stopped, it didn't open into the glass-lined modern workspace he had once sketched in early concept meetings. It opened into a corridor stacked with cleaning carts, unswept grit, and light panels that flickered like broken signals. Clem Dorsey was already waiting, arms crossed, back against the gray fire exit door. He didn't say anything at first, just pointed to a space at the wall across from a vending machine, a square of tile worn smooth by years of traffic, barely wide enough for someone to sit. He jerked his head toward it and told Ellison to sit. Not in an office, not in a holding room, just on the floor, in view of every person walking through the staff wing. Sit right there, against the wall. Ellison didn't move at first. He looked to the hall beyond, where junior architects and consultants in tight slacks and lanyards with sleek security badges hurried from meeting to meeting, clutching sketch tablets and metal tumblers. Clem stepped closer, lowered his voice, and told him to stop stalling. That security protocols required pause and hold for visitors with unverified credentials and no logged itinerary. Then he said the phrase again, louder. Unverified credentials. The same phrase echoed off the concrete and tile, bouncing toward the hallway. A woman in a navy blazer slowed mid-step, made brief eye contact with Ellison, and then turned sharply down a different hall. Ellison sat. He pressed his back against the cool tile, set his model case between his feet, and rested his arms on his knees. The satchel hung loosely off one shoulder, and the zipper clicked softly with each breath. He looked ahead, not at the people passing by, but at the smudged base of the vending machine across from him. It glowed faintly, humming like a soft engine. After a few minutes, Clem returned with a coffee cup. He sipped slowly while leaning on the wall like he owned the building. A few of the floor's younger interns walked past in pairs. One nudged the other when they saw Ellison sitting cross-legged. They whispered, poorly hiding the laughter in their voices. One of them turned back and pointed at the scuffed toes of Ellison's boots, then made a gagging face. Clem noticed and waved them over. He called them by name and asked if they'd ever seen anyone deliver pizzas who brought their own luggage. The interns laughed louder now. One pulled out a key card and flashed it dramatically, saying he'd guard the vault in case Ellison made a break for it. Clem added another line, something about trespassers looking for forgotten blueprints to sell. Another woman passed by, not an intern but not senior either, and though she didn't laugh, she did glance down, then up at the security camera mounted near the exit. She said nothing. She kept walking. Ellison sat still. His knees ached against the tile. His wrist had gone stiff from gripping the model handle too tightly for too long. A thin smear of dust from the floor now marked the bottom edge of his coat. Time slowed. He remembered being 6 years old, sitting in the corner of a Detroit school hallway on a punishment that hadn't been his fault. He remembered the silence of that corner, the echo of sneakers, and the judgment of glances that came without context. It felt the same now. Same eyes. Same heat behind his ribs. Only this time, he was a grown man being watched like an object planted on the floor for decoration. Clem came back 15 minutes later. He carried a small form in one hand, an intake slip for external vendors, usually reserved for repairmen and external tech crews. He told Ellison that he'd be filling it out under supervision, and then would be directed to a security briefing before entering any non-public zones. Ellison looked up, his face unreadable. Clem tapped the slip twice and said it was standard. Ellison didn't move. Clem stepped forward and dropped the form into Ellison's lap, forcing it to slide off the satchel and land on the floor. When Ellison didn't pick it up right away, Clem stepped on the corner. Then he removed his boot slowly and let the slip remain crumpled beneath Ellison's thigh. More laughter down the hall. The interns had circled back. This time, they weren't whispering. One pointed and joked that it looked like someone got caught stealing Wi-Fi from the executive wing. Clem offered a final comment about squatters finding warmth in corporate lobbies, then told Ellison he had 5 minutes to comply or else building services would remove him with force. Still, Ellison didn't respond. His chest rose and fell in long, deliberate breaths. Inside, the heat built. Not rage, not protest, just the familiar weight of being measured by people who couldn't read the dimensions of what they stood on. He had drafted every single structural line of the floor beneath them. After a long, patronizing sip of soup, Clem pulled out his radio and made a call that wasn't coded for dispatch. He told someone to send up a member of maintenance to confirm a stray body in the hallway. When Clem signed off, he leaned forward and told Ellison casually that the way he sat made it hard to know if he was here to fix something or waiting to be repaired. A few minutes later, a maintenance worker in navy blue coveralls ambled up the hallway, wiping grease off his palms with a rag that had more oil than cotton left. The man was maybe mid-50s, heavy-set, with a gait that suggested he'd been lifting things the wrong way for too many years. Clem waved him down and pointed a finger at Ellison. He asked, flat out, if the guy belonged to their crew. The worker looked at Ellison, puzzled, then gave a single shrug. Didn't recognize him. Not one of mine, the man said with a slow shake of his head. Clem clapped his hands once like someone confirming a theory, then turned to Ellison and said loud enough for the ceiling to hear that unauthorized access through the loading dock was getting more creative these days. Clem said it like a joke, but with the authority of someone who wanted it to sound like evidence. He then stood fully upright, soup forgotten, and took a step forward, glancing down at Ellison's hands. He noticed the dark creases around the knuckles, the tiny black cuts along the thumbs, the stains that never washed out fully no matter how many times a man rinsed his palms with orange-scented degreaser. Without warning, Clem reached down, grabbed Ellison's wrist, and raised it toward the overhead light. The movement startled the maintenance worker, who stepped back, blinking as Clem examined Ellison's hand like a specimen. "Look at this," Clem said, holding the hand up for the maintenance guy to inspect. "You believe this? This is not a consultant's hand. This is not an engineer's hand. This is someone who crawls through ductwork looking for copper." Clem dropped Ellison's arm like it offended him and shook his head with a sneer. Clean-handed men build towers, he said. Dirty-handed ones sneak into them. The maintenance worker didn't laugh. He scratched the side of his cheek and said he needed to finish checking a pump valve. He turned and walked away without another word, his boots dragging with a slow shame Clem didn't notice. Ellison pulled his sleeve down and tucked his hand into his coat pocket. He stayed on the floor, back to the tile, ignoring the pain in his thighs, ignoring the slow humiliation curling deeper into his ribs. He stared across the hall at the faded base of the vending machine and saw the faint reflection of himself in the chrome trim. He looked like a man waiting for his name to matter again. Clem leaned back against the wall with one foot up, eating soup with exaggerated slurps. He spoke aloud, not to Ellison, but to no one in particular, recounting how many strange types had wandered into this building over the years. He mentioned the time someone tried to sell stolen light fixtures, the man who claimed he was scouting filming locations, the guy who said he was an architecture student from Belgium but couldn't name a single U.S. city when asked. He said Ellison reminded him of all of them. A man with a story and a bag full of trash pretending it was gold. Clem finished the soup, crumpled the cup, and tossed it toward a trash bin near the corner. It bounced off the rim and rolled near Ellison's boot. Clem didn't pick it up. Instead, he glanced at his watch and muttered that building enforcement would be notified if clearance didn't come through in the next 10 minutes. He then said something about checking the loading dock camera footage to confirm whether Ellison had come in through the back with a crew or just slipped in between badge scans. Clem walked off again, radio in hand, muttering and chuckling as he disappeared around the corner. Ellison finally exhaled. It had become mechanical now, breathing, focusing on staying still, letting the verbal filth wash over without letting it stain his mind. He was used to being mistaken for something less than what he was, but never to this depth, not here, not inside the structure he had shaped like a sculptor with steel and reinforced thought. He looked down at his hands. The skin was cracked at the edge of the knuckles. His nails were trimmed clean, but rough, not polished. These were hands that had marked red lines across faulty load paths at 3 a.m., hands that had guided student interns through CAD corrections, hands that had drawn the initial sketch of Echelon Tower's core reinforcement spine in pencil on a napkin during a lunch break 3 years ago. But none of that lived in his hands now, not in the way Clem saw them. Clem saw only dirt, only labor, only something beneath him. A custodian passed the hallway, glanced down the corridor, and kept walking. A manager rounded the corner with a clipboard, gave a double take at Ellison, and frowned like someone spotting a misplaced package. No one said anything. No one asked questions. Ellison's name remained unheard. The model case beside him still glinted dully under the fluorescent lights, its edge now dented from being set down too hard. The blueprint roll was tucked under his thigh, its cap slightly loose. And inside Ellison, a memory returned. A moment from a year ago, when he stood before a city planning board and presented a structural adaptation proposal that saved the company $3 million in long-term energy costs. He remembered the handshake, the thanks, the follow-up meetings. Clem's steps were slower now, deliberate, as though savoring the continued performance of authority he had written himself into. He stopped 2 feet away and without greeting gestured toward Ellison to stand up. When Ellison hesitated, more from the stiffness in his legs than defiance, Clem raised his voice half a step and ordered him to comply under Building Policy Section 9-4, which he quoted as if it had weight. Ellison unfolded his legs, rose carefully, keeping the model tight to his side, and followed Clem down a side hall to a locked door marked Facility Prep. Clem entered a code on the keypad and pushed the door open with a shoulder, gesturing for Ellison to go in first. The room was small, windowless, dimly lit by a single fluorescent bar overhead. A metal table stood in the middle, flanked by 2 battered plastic chairs. In the far corner was a tall gray bin marked inspection waste, its lid cracked open and lined with a clear plastic bag inside. A security camera lens blinked red from the upper corner. Clem motioned to the table and told Ellison to set everything down for final processing. When Ellison reached to gently place the model case on the surface, Clem interrupted him, saying the model was already flagged as unauthorized material and would be tagged accordingly. Ellison did not argue. He simply adjusted his satchel to slide it down, careful not to drop anything. Clem stepped in and, without warning, grabbed the satchel by the strap, yanked it from Ellison's shoulder, and tossed it into the open inspection bin. The sound of metal against plastic echoed sharply in the room. Pens clattered. The edge of the photograph slipped from the pocket and disappeared beneath the other items. Clem added that any personal property not previously registered was now subject to disposal review. Ellison took one step forward, eyes fixed on the bag, but Clem raised a hand and told him to freeze. He held up the bundle of gray fabric now and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a thud, a folded janitor's jumpsuit with a white adhesive name tag already stuck across the left breast, Building SVCS, handwritten in black marker. Clem informed him that, until credentials were verified, Ellison would need to wear standard temporary, were assigned to all unregistered personnel. He said it as if it were common, necessary, completely reasonable. Ellison stood still. Clem tapped his watch. Change now. In the corner was a portable screen, barely shielding a 4x4 changing space with a metal hook on one side. No mirror, no shelf, no privacy. Clem waited, arms crossed, as Ellison stepped slowly behind the curtain. He removed his coat first, folded it even though it was already creased and stained. His hoodie followed, then his shirt, each layer exposing more of the cold that had clung to him since standing outside. He looked down at his hands as he unbuttoned his jeans, still slightly marked with dirt from a sidewalk, then stepped into the gray jumpsuit, stiff and one size too tight in the shoulders. The zipper stuck at first. He tugged it slowly up to his neck. The fabric scratched against his skin. He stepped back out holding his bundled clothes in one hand, uncertain where to put them. Clem took the bundle without asking, turned toward a metal cabinet, and stuffed the clothing into a plastic evidence bag marked Visitor Hold. The model case remained on the table untouched, its contents still technically visible, yet unseen. Clem took a step back and looked Ellison over from head to toe. He commented that now, at least, he looked like he belonged. The name tag fluttered slightly as Ellison shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the jumpsuit still stiff from disuse. Clem took out his phone, opened an internal directory, and made a call. He told whoever was on the other line that he had a possible unauthorized janitorial temp with unclear paperwork, and that facilities might want to verify if any backshift coverage had been requested. Clem used phrases like operational risk and internal security posture, turning a simple oversight into a fabricated protocol breach. He never mentioned the appointment, never mentioned floor 39, never mentioned the man's name. After the call, Clem told Ellison he would be escorted shortly to a sublevel service room to await further review. In the meantime, he was to remain in the current uniform, refrain from accessing any internal pathways without clearance, and keep hands visible at all times. Ellison nodded once, not from agreement, but from necessity. He had said nothing since stepping into the room. Words were no longer bridges, they were fuel for fire, and Clem would burn anything he was given. A few minutes passed in silence. Clem left the room briefly, and Ellison stood alone. He glanced down at his chest where the name tag sat, the letters uneven and rushed. He looked at the bin where his satchel had vanished, and behind it, the cabinet that now held the only clothes that truly belonged to him. He touched the sleeve of the jumpsuit, stiff and unfamiliar. It smelled of antiseptic and plastic wrap. Everything about him had been stripped or replaced. The man who walked in with tools of design was now being reshaped into a silhouette of labor with no face, no voice, no place. When Clem returned, he brought with him a younger security aide, barely older than an intern, who looked confused as he was instructed to escort the janitor to the facility's weight room on Sub 2. Ellison was handed a small laminated pass with the word temp pressed into it in faded ink. He clipped it to the zipper of the jumpsuit. The aide didn't make eye contact, only gestured toward the hall and mumbled directions. The elevator door opened into a dim corridor that smelled faintly of damp concrete and stale cleaner. The aide stepped out first and motioned for Ellison to follow, then led him through a narrow hallway with flickering lights and into a small glass-walled office beside a utility stairwell. The space was barely large enough for 2 chairs and a table, its transparent walls allowing a full view from the hall on both sides. The security aide stepped outside and made a short call from a corner. Moments later, Clem's voice returned through the building's internal comms, giving new instructions. Ellison was to be held there until verification could be completed. Clem had reported a case of impersonation to the facilities board, citing that the man in the janitor's uniform had arrived without proper ID, carried unauthorized materials, and refused to comply with several directives. The aide did not question it. He locked the door from the outside and left without saying a word. Ellison was now sealed in a glass box, placed like an exhibit in a hallway that no one had asked to view, but everyone could see. Within minutes, the usual trickle of building staff resumed. A woman pushing a supply cart glanced into the room, slowed, and then kept walking. A pair of designers with floor plans rolled under their arms passed by and muttered quietly, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Ellison sat in the chair with his arms folded, the model case still on his lap, his back straight despite the growing fatigue in his spine. His presence said nothing. His silence screamed everything. At 10:37 a.m., the fire alarm drill began. No sirens, no flashing strobes, just a mechanical voice overhead instructing all personnel on floors 3 through 8 to proceed to the stairwells for a routine system test. In seconds, the hallway flooded with movement. Dozens of people filed past the glass office, most in business casual layers, their eyes scanning, pausing, narrowing when they saw him seated inside. A few slowed their pace, curiosity sparked by the sealed door and the lone man in gray sitting without expression. They didn't ask what happened. They assumed. A woman nudged her colleague and whispered with a faint smirk that the building had had problems before with theft from temp workers. Someone else looked over his shoulder and muttered that security must have finally caught one. He used the phrase, "They always try something," with a tone that blended warning and weariness. Another young analyst walked by and casually took out her phone, pretending to check messages, but angling the camera briefly toward the room. She didn't take a picture. She just watched him through the screen. Ellison didn't flinch. He didn't raise his eyes. He stared forward, letting the room's silence envelop him, though the noise outside cracked through the glass like sleet against a window pane. Inside his mind, a diagram of the very corridor he sat in assembled itself, its steel beams, corner stress points, electrical lines, and ductwork overlaying in his imagination like a living draft. He could still remember the revised cable tension schedules he'd submitted during construction, the ones that eliminated the vibration issues in the south stairwell. The problem had cost them 2 months, and he had solved it in 2 days. Now the same stairwell funneled people past him like he was a sign taped to the wall, warning others to stay in line or end up boxed behind glass. The fire drill ended, and with it, the movement in the corridor slowed. A cleaning crew passed by next, pulling trash bins behind them, one of the men nodding politely through the glass. Ellison returned the nod reflexively, unsure if the gesture meant respect or pity. At 11:10, Clem arrived in person, walking down the hall with a rolled-up document in one hand and a half-smile on his face. He tapped on the glass with a single knuckle, then opened the door with a badge swipe. He stepped inside, set the document on the table, and remained standing. He told Ellison that the internal system still showed no clearance, that no one on floor 39 had confirmed his appointment, and that the burden of proof remained on the visitor. He used terms like discrepancy and standard protocol and suggested that, for the good of the building, it might be best if Ellison cooperated fully with further inspection. Then Clem unrolled the document, revealing one of the tower's older schematic layers, marked with revisions and builder codes. He gestured toward one particular detail, a junction node that had been changed 3 months after Ellison's original design submission. Clem pointed at the corner of the print and remarked that no signature had been logged on the final copy. Ellison looked at it and realized the page was a lower-resolution internal copy, incomplete and without his stamped index. Clem concluded smugly that if Ellison had been truly part of the design team, his name would be on this print. Outside, The corridor beyond the transparent walls had gone mostly quiet again. A few staff moved past, some glancing in, others pretending not to see him at all. To them, the room was not just confinement, it was confirmation. That a man sitting alone, behind glass in a uniform he hadn't earned must have done something wrong. No one knocked. No one asked. They simply passed. Then, just after noon, the door clicked open again. Not with Clem's heavy-handed authority, but a soft badge swipe followed by hesitation. A thin man stepped in, no more than 30, with a folder under one arm and nervous eyes scanning the room like he wasn't sure if he'd entered the right place. His lanyard read Ezra Weller, Junior Design, Level 4. He didn't speak at first. He looked down at the folder in his hands, then at Ellison. "I was told to drop this here," he said, half under his breath, as though rehearsing the sentence for someone who wouldn't answer. He placed the folder on the table, glancing at the model case balanced on Ellison's lap. He paused, curiosity flickering across his face. "That's not one of ours, is it?" he asked, pointing toward the case. Ellison didn't speak, but the question hung there, unanswered and unfinished. Ezra squinted, leaning slightly closer. "That frame design. It looks like the one from the alternate support strategy they proposed for Level 17. But that version wasn't published, was it?" He blinked. "The internal load-bearing curve, the 3-tier flange split. No one uses that anymore." Ezra tilted his head, searching Ellison's face for a signal. "You know that joint failed the initial torque stress test. Then it passed again, after someone rotated the primary axis by 6 degrees and offset the lateral bracing. But that wasn't in the shared file. Nobody talks about that fix because it happened before approvals. So how do you know?" Ellison raised his eyes slowly. His voice came soft but firm. "Because I corrected it." Ezra froze. His folder slipped slightly under his elbow. "You?" "But that..." He cut himself off. His eyes dropped to the model again, then back to Ellison. He stared longer now, as if re-seeing the man he had walked past just moments ago. "Wait, you mean..." He backed toward the door slowly, breath catching. "I think I need to check something," he said, voice cracking slightly. The door opened again, and he vanished down the hall without waiting for a reply. Ellison sat still. His hands remained around the model case. But in that single moment, the first fracture in the silence had formed. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Nothing returned to normal. Then, up on floor 39, Ezra burst through the design wing, bypassed reception, and slammed the folder down in front of a senior partner named Landon Kerr. Ezra said no greetings, no pleasantries. He said one thing, that he had just spoken with the man who corrected the tower's Level 17 bracing design before it went to bid, a design no one outside the core team ever saw. At first, Landon didn't react. Then he looked up sharply and asked Ezra to repeat himself. Ezra did, slowly this time, and added one more name, the name that should have been on every schematic. Kerr stood without another word. He made 2 calls, first to building admin, second to security control. The instructions were simple. Hold all enforcement actions. Now, no movement, no transfers, no removals. Leave the man in place. Do not engage further until authorized personnel arrive. On Sub 2, the hallway outside the glass room fell still. No new footsteps echoed. No new orders came. Ellison sensed something shift. Not a noise, not a word. When Landon reached the security holding room, the aide standing nearby began to speak, but Landon raised one hand and silenced him with a single look. He swiped his badge, entered the code, and opened the glass door without hesitation. Ellison Ridge looked up slowly as the door slid open, his hand still resting on the aluminum model case, the gray janitor's uniform stiff against his frame. He didn't stand. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at the man entering the room, like someone watching a wave decide whether to recede or rise. Landon closed the door behind him and pulled the spare chair back from the table before sitting across from Ellison, the silence pressing between them like a thin sheet of tension, impossible to ignore. Landon didn't start with an apology, not yet. He placed both hands on the table, leaned slightly forward, and asked the question that had been circling his mind since Ezra burst into his office 20 minutes earlier. "Why didn't you say who you were?" Ellison looked at him without bitterness, without pride. His voice, when it came, was steady and low. "Because no one asked." Landon blinked once, absorbing the answer like a slap to his own certainty. He looked down at the model case, then at the temp badge still clipped awkwardly to Ellison's chest. For a long second, neither man spoke. Then Landon leaned back, pulled out his phone, and made one call to the administrative coordinator of the design wing. He told her to gather the team in the main conference atrium. All personnel, no delays. When asked why, he simply said, because it's time they all remembered who built their foundation. The elevator to the atrium was fast and silent. Landon walked slightly ahead of Ellison, who had changed back into his own clothes retrieved from the facility cabinet. The janitor's jumpsuit folded tightly beneath his arm, like a skin he had shed. His boots had been wiped, but not cleaned fully, the scuffs still etched into the leather. The photo of his wife and child remained bent, but tucked safely back into the inner sleeve of his satchel. When they stepped into the atrium, the room quieted instantly. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Laptops were set down. Eyes turned. Around the central table stood members of the structural and concept teams, architects, design analysts, even the junior intern who had laughed earlier by the elevators. Clem Dorsey was not in sight. Landon stepped to the center, cleared his throat once, and gestured for Ellison to join him. With a calm that came not from pride but from control, Ellison stepped beside him. Landon turned to the room and spoke without ceremony. "This is Ellison Ridge, the structural architect responsible for the core design, internal reinforcement methodology, and adaptive load strategy of this tower." He gestured to the walls around them, the high ceiling, the intersecting steel arcs supporting the atrium's glass dome. Every piece of this, from the subraid foundation to the sky bridge, carries his calculations. His name should be on your wall. His work is already beneath your feet. A hush fell like snow over the room. Landon didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Recognition sparked slowly. Faces changed shade, and the weight of what had just been revealed passed through the crowd like an invisible tide. A few people murmured, some nodding to themselves as puzzle pieces realigned. One engineer remembered an obscure line item in an old blueprint set labeled ER1. Another recalled hearing rumors of a reclusive consultant whose models had salvaged the original cost overrun. Ezra stood near the back, arms crossed, a look of stunned pride etched deep into his features. One by one, people stepped forward, not with fanfare, but with quiet intention. A young woman from the draft simulation group reached for the model case and asked, with hesitant awe, if it was the original mock-up. Ellison nodded once. Another analyst offered a soft apology, eyes low. As the design team returned to their stations and conversations resumed with new reverence, the focus quietly shifted to another corridor of the building, one far colder in tone and far more abrupt in consequence. Clem Dorsey had been summoned to the compliance wing, not by request, but by instruction, issued directly from building oversight under the authority of executive partner Landon Kerr and corporate risk evaluation. The notice had arrived via internal alert at 1:03 p.m., and by 1:11, Clem stood at the far end of conference room 14, his badge scanned at the entry by a junior operations clerk who neither spoke nor looked him in the eye. Across from Clem sat three individuals, one from facilities administration, one from legal, and one from HR oversight. No smiles greeted him. No seats were offered until they confirmed his ID had been logged. The footage began to play before a single question was asked. On a large wall monitor, time-stamped video from multiple security cameras flickered through the moments with brutal clarity. There was Ellison in the lobby, stopped just inside the revolving doors, hands calmly at his side, the appointment slip extended. There was Clem brushing it aside. Another angle showed the satchel being emptied, sketches falling onto the floor. Another still frame captured the folded blueprint plane soaring into the puddle. The room stayed silent. Clem tried to clear his throat. He attempted a weak explanation about protocol and inconsistency in identification. He mentioned procedure, cited past incidents, pointed to training gaps. But no one wrote his words down. They were not interested in excuses rooted in bias, especially not after the broadcast of Stage 8 had quietly gone live through the building's internal recognition channels. The footage continued. The moment Clem lifted Ellison's hand to mop the calluses, the way he leaned against the table while the model was examined without care, the bag tossed into the inspection bin, the janitor uniform shoved forward as a requirement. When Clem attempted to assert authority again, legal interrupted him for the first and only time. They reminded him that impersonation of policy was a disciplinary violation, that manufactured protocol beyond standard regulation was grounds for termination review, and that racial targeting under the guise of security would be subject to full investigation under state compliance. Clem stopped speaking after that. The final video played. Ellison inside the glass room, seated quietly while staff walked past, assuming his guilt, whispering suspicions born not from fact, but from the visual suggestion Clem had orchestrated. The frame paused on the moment when Ellison lifted his model slightly, brushing dust from the base with one worn thumb. The oversight team turned the monitor off. HR read the verdict without ceremony. Effective immediately, Clem Dorsey would be suspended indefinitely pending final review, stripped of internal access, and removed from the premises under escort. His pay would be frozen. His office would be cleared by compliance staff. He would receive no severance unless exoneration occurred following full investigation, which, they noted clearly, was statistically improbable. Clem blinked slowly. His shoulders had dropped. He nodded once, said nothing, and stood as security staff entered the room. They did not touch him. They did not speak. They merely walked with him through the same halls he had patrolled with smug confidence, down past the internal stair where he had watched Ellison sit like an unwanted package, and through the same lobby doors where he had once declared authority over a man whose presence he now could not meet. The receptionist looked up, then quickly away, pretending to answer a call. A janitor paused beside a mop bucket, noticing the change in uniform dynamics. Outside, a black town car waited, not for Clem, but for a senior consultant. Yet Clem stood beside it briefly, uncertain where to go. The guard stopped at the edge of the sidewalk. The building did not forget, though its elevators still chimed at each arrival, and the overhead lights hummed across identical routines. Something had changed. Not in the steel or concrete, but in the people who moved between them. They walked slower past the reception desk now. They nodded to custodians they once passed wordlessly. Conversations in the break rooms carried a new tension, a mindfulness, a hesitation not rooted in fear, but in the dawning awareness that an injustice had occurred in plain view, and none of them had spoken. Ellison Ridge returned to the building 3 days after the disciplinary action concluded. Not because he had been summoned or because he needed to complete unfinished work, but because Landon Kerr had quietly asked if he would like to sit in on a mentorship panel for first-year interns. Ellison had agreed, not to be recognized, not to be applauded, but because he believed the next wave of builders needed to hear more than code specifications and budget strategy. They needed to learn how to see. He arrived early, this time wearing a dark wool coat freshly pressed, his boots oiled and clean. The satchel still hung at his side, though lighter now, its burden no longer hidden. He passed through the main doors, and this time no one stopped him. The front desk assistant nodded, and security offered a quiet greeting with no clipboard in sight. Ezra Weller walked beside him toward the auditorium, carrying a tablet and a printed schedule. Along the way, they passed by a narrow window near the lobby's edge, where a single wooden bench sat beside an indoor planter. Ellison paused. Ezra looked over, confused, but said nothing. Ellison gestured slightly with his chin. "Give me 10 minutes, then I'll join." Ezra nodded once and walked off. Seated on the bench was Clem Dorsey, not in his uniform, not with a badge clipped to his chest or a radio pressed to his hip, but in plain clothes, slacks, and a button coat. His hair combed too carefully, hands resting palms down on his knees like a man waiting not for permission, but for courage. He stood slowly when Ellison approached and took off his cap, eyes uncertain, mouth set in a line that trembled faintly at the corners. He did not offer excuses. He did not blame misunderstanding or procedure or policy. He said only a few words, each of them carrying the weight of something deeper than regret. "I didn't see you. I thought I did, but I didn't. And that's on me." Ellison said nothing for a long moment. He looked out at the courtyard beyond the glass, where sunlight struck the edge of the fountain just so, creating a shard of reflected light across the entry tiles. Then he turned back. "What you saw wasn't me. What you saw was a story you've been told so long, you started living it." Clem nodded. He looked down at his hands. "I've lived inside those stories my whole life," he said. "I just never thought I was the one telling them." They sat, not close but side by side, the silence between them no longer hostile, but filled with the possibility of recognition. Clem spoke again, softer this time. "When I started working security, I told myself I was protecting people, that I was keeping order. I never stopped to ask who decided what order looked like." He paused. "Until you." Ellison watched him without judgment. He had heard apologies before, but this was different. Not because it came late, but because it came from the crack between power and understanding. The moment when someone realizes their comfort has been built on someone else's exclusion. Clem cleared his throat and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a course booklet from the City Community College and unfolded it carefully. At the top, in thick lettering, were the words "Introduction to Urban Design and Equity." He held it up for Ellison to see. "I enrolled," he said. "I figured if I'm going to work inside places like this, I should know what makes them live, not just what makes them stand." Ellison took the paper and looked at it briefly, then handed it back. "That's a start," he said. Clem nodded. "I just want to do better. Not for a headline. Not for anyone else. Just because I should have a long time ago." The two men stood again. Ellison offered a hand. Not quickly, not with ceremony, but steadily. Clem took it. There was no applause, no crowd, no speech. Just two men who had once stood on opposite sides of silence, now meeting in the center of it. Ellison turned and walked toward the auditorium. Clem remained behind, seated again, his hands resting more lightly now. Inside, the mentorship panel had already begun. Ezra introduced the session, calling attention to the importance of not only learning from diagrams, but learning from a lived experience of those who had built what others only inherited. Ellison entered without fanfare and took his seat on the panel beside other seasoned architects. He shared stories, not of success, but of friction, of resistance, of quiet resilience shaped over years of being seen, as less until his designs were too strong to ignore. In the back of the room, one in turn whispered to another that this was the man whose reinforcement method had been used in the new expansion, that he had redefined seismic response on mid-tier towers, that his model had once survived a drop from 5 floors without a fracture. Ellison didn't hear it. He was already speaking again, this time about thresholds, the literal ones and the metaphorical, about how buildings and people both carry weight, and how sometimes the difference between collapse and stability is a single change in support. Outside, Clem Dorsey stepped into the light of the courtyard and sat on a bench near the perimeter, his eyes lifted not to the doors but to the sky. He had spent years watching others pass through spaces he believed he controlled. Now, for the first time, he was learning how to enter them. The end. If this story moved you, let us know by liking and subscribing so you won't miss what's coming next. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot twists? Were you surprised by how things unfolded? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and which part hit you the hardest. Your feedback helps shape future stories, and we're always listening. Stay tuned. More powerful narratives are on the way.